I'm a huge RTS fan. Maybe the biggest RTS fan in the world. Or at least I thought I was. I've tried various RTS games in the last few years, and it turns out I don't love each and every one of them. Some are outright bad, whereas others are fun, but not very exciting to me. I started feeling pretty hyper-judgmental because sometimes I'd be yucking other people's yums. Such as when I didn't fall in love when I first tried out Warhammer 40k Dawn of War. I was doing the campaign and everyone was telling me how amazing it was, and I just wasn't really enjoying myself that much. So I thought maybe I just don't like campaigns. Stormgate has been a pretty big disappointment. Expectations were pretty high. Roughly as good as StarCraft's spiritual successor for StarCraft, it's an extremely high standard that they have fallen short of in most ways. Maybe expectations were just too high? They Are Billions is another very popular RTS game that my community had been asking me to play, and it was pretty fun, but it didn't really scratch the itch for me as much as some of my favorite classic games. Company of Heroes 3 was another anticipated title, greatly anticipated. Company of Heroes 1 and 2, for all intents and purposes, seemed pretty popular. But when I played it, it kind of felt like a hot mess. The FPS performance was subpar, the gameplay was uninteresting to me, and I felt handicapped in unit control, as it really doesn't play out the same as some of the other RTS that I've played. Units get locked in combat, and it's more about positional play and so on. And there's a complete lack of worker management and base building. With so many games being so disappointing to me, I started thinking perhaps I hate RTS? Or maybe the question is, do I like RTS as a whole, or just specific subgenres of it? So is there any game genre that offers less clarity about the expected game experience you're going to be having than the label of RTS? I used to think I know exactly what RTS means. Obviously, it's a game like Command & Conquer, where you listen to rock and roll, and you callously waltz over measly infantry with your turbo tanks so that you can please your live-action commander-in-chief in the pursuit of obtaining control over your sector and harvesting all the available Tiberium. Or maybe RTS is the type of game where you see a smaller Tapazerg and you profess your love for Sarge, as you prepare to wage interstellar war in order to obtain a kiss from a woman you once swore to kill. In StarCraft 1 and 2, you sweatily pump out hundreds of actions per minute to control your army in competitive multiplayer combat. Or you play some of the best RTS campaigns ever made. At least I think they're the f***ing best. In this video, I'll define RTS games as a genre, and I'll go over a list of recently released RTS games, as well as some of the upcoming RTS games that we may be excited about. For me, when I hear RTS, I think about games that are at their core about emphasizing multitasking, multiple resource management, worker management, and army micromanagement through campaigns, single-player story missions, and competitive multiplayer matches. You'll be expanding to new resource locations, all the while harassing opponents furiously as you order your units around, carefully controlling each and one of them for maximum efficiency. All of this in a real-time environment from an isometric viewpoint. But I realize that some of those definitions are not so hard-coded in the RTS DNA. You could take away worker production and management and add beacon control and still undeniably end up with an RTS, as attested by games such as Dawn of War 1 and 2, we don't mention Dawn of War 3, sorry, or Company of Heroes 1 and 2, we don't mention Company of Heroes 3. You could add heroes into the mixture of an otherwise normal classical RTS by adding a flair of RPG, and you get Warcraft 3, which is still a somewhat classical RTS, but with the RPG hero element. Even the multiplayer aspect of a game is not core and wholly to the definition of the RTS genre. Single-player focused RTS games allow developers to focus more on the spectacle and the power fantasy rather than the competitive integrity and the multiplayer balance. Not every RTS game is meant to leave you with sweaty pits after one bout of its gameplay, and even the aforementioned games have more casual game modes via their custom map editor creations. Age of Empires, StarCraft and Warcraft all have great custom map experiences that, while I didn't play them as much, is a really large part of enjoying those games for many people. For some of the games that are not these games, I have often felt that they get categorized as RTS games, but they don't even cut the mustard to be classified as such. For a large part of my life, I felt a sense of elitism, and it made me gatekeep what it means to call a game an RTS, when so-called RTS games don't even play out anything like the Warcrafts, StarCrafts, Age of Empires, and Command & Conquers of this world. I would actually get confused when my community informs me of a new RTS, the very sound of which sets my heart aflutter. But when checking out the game, it turns out it's actually a single-player tower defense game like They Are Billions, the likes of which stills my heart a little bit more into a slow burn quiescence. They Are Billions, by the way, is a good game, but it's not quite a classical RTS that leverages my personal favorite features as its core gameplay pillars. What are some of my favorite pillars? Well, I greatly value worker management, army micromanagement, resource management, and I also love heroes in my RTS games. So that narrows down the list a bit. But what is the list? RTS as a label alone can be a poor descriptor to indicate the expected gaming experience a player may reasonably expect. This is why I've gone to look for neo affixes to the RTS tag in order to create the right expectations when we talk about RTS games. But as it turns out, those affixes already actually exist. Steam has many tags like Action RTS and City Building RTS, and there's also a Reddit thread that talks about some of the upcoming RTS titles, which I use to source some of the titles that I know are going to be coming up. And they also have a whole slew of different tags and subgenres, so I'm going to be going into some of those. First and foremost, there's the classic RTS, or the classical RTS. In these, you create workers, gather resources with them, you build buildings with those resources, which then enable the training of troops. These troops can be used to kill other armies, workers and buildings, and the primary win condition is usually elimination of all units and/or buildings, whereas there may be secondary objectives like zone control or point control. For some purists, any win condition outside of elimination may already place the game outside of the classic RTS genre, but I've included them anyway since I feel like Age of Empires 4 is actually an example of a classic RTS, and they do have a secondary and a tertiary win condition outside of mere elimination. Overall, classic RTS games are an amazing display of multitasking, and they're an APM stress test. However, they can still be enjoyable in single-player campaigns or custom games against AI without all that noise. Great examples are StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, Warcraft 2, Age of Empires 1 through 4, Command & Conquer, and Age of Mythology. Next up, one of my favorite genres, the RPG RTS genre. At its core, they're also classical RTS games, but they essentially introduce the hero element. You can have a small limited amount of heroes, which are essentially a special unit that you can have a limited amount of that introduce the unit veterancy mechanic, and usually it'll be called hero levels. Upon obtaining more experience, they level up and they become more powerful. Normal units upgrade via resources and upgrades, whereas hero units upgrade from getting kills, either on NPCs or enemy player controlled units. This introduces an inherent snowball mechanic because your heroes get more powerful when you kill things, and that means that you're only going to get more ahead when you get ahead. And that requires some gameplay design elements to counter that mechanic via anti-snowball gameplay mechanics. But overall, the power fantasy of growing the power of your hero and attaching more feeling and story to that hero is a fun mechanic that makes RPG RTS one of my favorites. And some examples include Warcraft 3, Spellforce 3, and Godzorn. Then there's the City Builder RTS. City Builder RTS games embrace the core feature of building up one's base and then seeing the bustling city thrive. The sound of wood logging and the satisfaction of seeing your city become ever bigger may be even more important than any war you may be having with NPCs or enemy players. The competitive aspect is less important than the fantasy of growing your base. It's the kind of game that classic RTS gamers are looking for when they say, I like Warcraft 3, but opponents always come and rush me way too early and that's not fun. In effect, these games are more single player than multiplayer, even when you play them in multiplayer. Example games include Settlers, Northgard, and Against the Storm. Then you've got the Tower Defense RTS, probably largely influenced by Tower Defense map-edited games from games like StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3. Tower Defense RTS have come up and are also classified as RTS, but they play out very differently. You build up a base, in that sense it's similar to City Builder RTS, but the goal is usually to defend against large swathes of forces from an NPC. The primary focus will be to defend giant attack waves that come in certain intervals, so you build up your base and everything is peaceful and happy and you build some towers and then suddenly 10,000 units are coming at you. You defend that and then you go to the next wave. It's a very fun genre that I think you'll agree doesn't really compare itself that well to a game like StarCraft, where you're not just defending against waves of attacks, where maybe one of the campaign missions is like that, but then the rest of it is more of a multitask ebb and flow between different gameplay mechanics. Examples include Warcana, Cataclysmo, and They Are Billions. I enjoyed Warcana and They Are Billions quite a lot, but they don't scratch the same itch as a more classic RTS does for me. But overall, it's a great genre that is lovely to play. Then you've got a different type of hybrid genre, which is the 4X RTS. RTX games that combine 4X elements. 4X is a turn-based strategy game genre that stands for expand, exploit, explore, and exterminate, and those four together form the underpinnings of a turn-based strategy game where you are building up your city, but it's turn-based normally, and then you're expanding across the map, developing your technology tree, and getting ever more advanced units. Meanwhile, you're engaging oftentimes in politics and diplomacy, and you usually have anywhere from 4 to 7 win conditions, which aren't all centered around elimination. You can have diplomatic victory, economic victory, domination victory, etc. Normally these games are games like Civilization 6 or Humankind. Once you combine 4X with RTS, you get games that are played in real time, and in single player they're often pausable, as you can still issue commands during the pause in order to take away some of the more urgent stress that you might have during such a game. Games that play in this genre are such games as Sins of the Solar Empire, Sins of the Solar Empire 2, to a degree Total War Warhammer 3, which does have a turn-based world map, but then in combat it is more of an RTS game, and Dune Spice Wars, which is a truly hybridic 4X RTS game, where you can pause against AI, but once it's multiplayer, no pausing. Next up is a genre that Relic Studios knows a lot about. It's the tactical RTS. Tactical RTS games usually omit classic base building and worker building, and instead focus around the resources that are spread and capturable all over the map. You could also call this zone control RTS. In a tactical RTS, the goal is to pull players into the map and force them to vie over resources on the map. This allows them to focus on tactical and positional combat, and this is also a very popular genre of the RTS genre that doesn't have as much in common with classic RTS. Resources are gained not via workers getting resources from mineral fields or gold mines, but via occupying central bases, beacons or flags, and oftentimes these flags must also be held for actual victory conditions. Examples include Company of Heroes and Dawn of War. Sometimes tactical RTS has small to little overlap with another more poorly defined subgenre of RTS, which is action RTS. In the action RTS tag, you could include such games like Battle Aces or Immortal Gates of Pyre, both of which are yet to come out. Both tactical and action RTS games are like classical RTS, but with a deprecated core feature, such as no workers or no base building. This simplifies the game and maybe reduces stress in one area of such a game. They may also focus on reducing micromanagement of armies. This can feel like an impoverishment to players like me, but it can also feel like an enrichment for some players, as it enhances the focus on the other aspects of the game. These other aspects may be more enjoyable to some players. For my final subgenre, I've identified Survival RTS. Survival RTS includes games like RimWorld and Chromosome Evil 2. These combine the survival game genre with small beginnings and resource scavenging alongside with RTS. In these games, there will be a great existential threat all around you as you build up a sprawling base from the resources that you crash landed around. Games like this may include such titles as Frostpunk. In the comments, let me know which RTS game subgenres you guys enjoy the most, and especially if you can let me know why you enjoy those aspects the most. Besides talking about the genre, I think it's really useful to talk about the single player quotient. This is a term I developed myself, which I think is really interesting and helpful to discuss what kind of experience you can expect in multiplayer RTS games. Generally, I think more is better, but your opinion may differ on that. Allow me to explain. So I don't mean how much single player content there is, like campaigns and story missions. I mean, how much single player minutes are there in multiplayer games? The way it works is like this. For how many minutes in a multiplayer game against another player are you going to be occupied with base building and fighting NPCs? Is that 1 minute on average? 10 minutes? The reason I think this is a useful metric is because it can help reveal whether you may be interested in a game or not. In StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void, the single player quotient is perhaps about 2 minutes. For 2 minutes you're building up your base and jump-starting your economy and preparing an initial defensive or offensive army, and then after that all hell breaks loose. After 2 minutes you're most likely scouting, poking, harassing and attacking one another. That may be just what you're looking for, or it might be a bit too hectic for you. Slightly less hectic is Warcraft 3, where the single player quotient is around 4 to 5 minutes. In a multiplayer game, you may spend up to 5 minutes mostly farming NPCs called creeps for experience to level up your heroes, all the while building up your base and working on your hero's power level, as well as developing your army. In the current version of Early Access of Stormgate, a scout unit called a dog may engage you in combat from second 20 or 30 into the game. So the single player quotient could actually be very, very low, as you'll constantly be microing your workers away from one dog harassing your workers very early on. While it is a scout unit, it also has a bit of a bite, and so this can feel pretty stressful, as attested by my own experience, as well as a recent video we watched from Uthermal. In Dune Spice Wars, which is a 4X/RTS game, you may enjoy up to 15 minutes of single player quotient before the real first contact, the real first struggle with an opponent. In general, higher amount of single player quotient lowers the stress a player may experience and adds more satisfaction and enjoyment for a player, even if they end up getting outskilled and soundly defeated by an opponent. In 0-minute single player quotient games, you may have spent 0 minutes constructively enjoying yourself, building up your base, since it's all skill based and all based on the interaction with your opponent. Alternatively, that's exactly the kind of gameplay you may enjoy, and then you'll love StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void, as it's a skill test from very early on. Part of Warcraft 3's charm in its single player quotient is that you get to have fun before you win or lose, by fighting the NPC creeps and leveling up. This is part of the reason I think that when many new Warcraft 3 players have been in my channel after they've been watching me and my content, they said they really enjoyed their first Warcraft 3 games, despite losing most of their games. I really didn't expect them to have fun sometimes, as I thought it could be pretty daunting to jump into a game that has a pretty seasoned player base, but the contrary of my expectation was they did enjoy themselves. And I think part of the key is that you get to have fun with your hero, leveling it up, fighting some creeps, and just kind of enjoying that part before being overwhelmed by some kind of rush at 6 or 7 minutes. Had Warcraft 3 had the Legacy of the Void treatment, where they accelerated the starts away from a 6-minute start to a 2-minute start, maybe people wouldn't be enjoying Warcraft 3 as much as a new player, because there wouldn't be as much time to get your bearings when starting a game. Anyway, that's my definition and summary of different subgenres of RTS games. Now let's go ahead and look at some of the RTS games that have come out recently, and some of the games that are going to be coming out in the next 1.5 years, to see which games I or you may think are fun or worth trying out. Since the beginning of 2023 and until the present day in 2024, I have found a list of about 13 RTS games that have released into a playable state. It's been pretty meager pickings the last 1.5 years, especially when it comes to the true classical RTS, which is my favorite genre, which has only seen one release in those 1.5 years. Of all the 13 RTS games that have come out, few have made as large of a splash as the city builder RTS, Manor Lords, that for some reason received a lot of viral word-of-mouth attention, which is deserved, by the way, as reviews are very positive. Its early access release in April 2024 saw a peak player count of 173,178 players, and even today, peak player count is still around 6,000 players. Here's a list of games that have released in 2024 and 2023, with the amount of buzz and review score around it. So if we start at the bottom here, in 2023, 4 RTS games came out according to some list and sourcing that I found. There may be some titles missing, but this is what I was able to find. Company of Heroes 3, Eyes of War, Chromosome Evil 2, and World Warfare and Economics. Of these 4 games, I only ended up trying Company of Heroes, which is sitting at a 15,000 reviewed mixed score with 56% Steam review rating. Not really living up to the Company of Heroes 1 and 2, which by the way I never played, and pretty similar to Dawn of War in its beacon control focused tactical RTS play. When I started playing this, for the first time, I didn't really define many of the different RTS genres yet. So when people said, or when I saw it's an RTS, I thought, okay, cool. There's going to be worker management, resource management, base building. And then I realized it was much more limiting in those aspects. And it's much more about having the feeling of controlling tanks and infantry units and positioning in buildings and then guarding certain areas. There's still a lot of multitasking and fighting in different places. And that concept of the game seems to be very popular, as people generally really enjoyed Dawn of War 1 and 2 and Company of Heroes 1 and 2. But Company of Heroes 3 seemed to not really live up to it. Some people enjoyed it, but overall it didn't make as big of a splash as it could have based on the title. I see that Eyes of War and Chromosome Evil 2 have been very well reviewed, with 90% scores, but didn't get to be as popular or as big as not many people reviewed or played it by comparison. It's just smaller titles, probably made by smaller teams, and I would be interested to play an RTS with 90% rating if they were in the classical RTS genre. Then moving up to 2024, we've got Godsworn, Manor Lords, Homeworld 3, Men of War 2, The Fertile Crescent, Nuke Them All, Cataclysmo, Stormgate, and Sins of a Solar Empire 2. Sins of a Solar Empire is a follow-up to Sins of a Solar Empire 1. It is a space-based 4X RTS game. Very similar to Homeworld 3 in that you are moving around in 3D space. A lot of people particularly like games that play out in space because they're big space nerds. I generally move around more in 2D space when I play RTS games, and those feel a little disorienting to me. Though I did end up playing Homeworld 3 and actually enjoyed it. I see that the ratings at the time of my research were mostly negative at 38% with 4,500 reviews, which is a shame for them, but a lot of people didn't like the rather short campaign, the fact that it was easy, that Homeworld 3 ended up getting rid of ship upgrades that Homeworld 1 and 2 had. There were some UI changes, and there were some accusations of DEI in the campaign as well. Overall, I did enjoy it, and I had the intent to play it again, but I will end up not following through with that as the reviews aren't that great, so probably it's not that great content for me to do on stream. I really enjoyed Godsworn. I launched Manor Lords for a bit and decided that type of game is very interesting for people, but probably not really for me, as I'm looking for something more competitive and less single player. And of course I've tried Stormgate as well, where I actually think the gameplay is more fun than most of the titles in the 2024 list. But there's also a lot of drawbacks, like a lackluster campaign, lackluster art angle, the sound design wasn't there yet, the game feels a little unfinished, and they haven't fully figured out the tier 3 yet as well. So at the moment, I'm not super interested in trying it a lot more. And I also think that there's been some bad PR around the game, as many people didn't like the art, but the developers did not seem very enthusiastic to change that anymore. Maybe they are not capable of doing that anymore. And Sins of a Solar Empire does look pretty interesting. It's a genre that I like, and the ratings are good, so maybe that's a game we should be checking out sometime in the future. I never played Sins of a Solar Empire 1, but the ratings seem attractive for me to try it out. In the next 1.5 years, many more RTS games are slated to come out, and there may be something to enjoy for everyone, even for me. Coming up in 2024, later this year or next year, we've got the following 32 or so titles. I've bolded the titles that I think I'm most interested in. We've got games coming such as Block Strategy, which is a base building RTS, Assembly, which is also a base building RTS, then Module War, which is actually a classic RTS that I pretty much didn't hear anyone talk about yet, but it looks pretty interesting when looking at some of the gameplay footage. I hope that one is going to be fun. I'll be looking out for that Q4 this year. Then there's Fragile Existence, some form of hybrid RTS, Strategos, or however to say that, which I believe is simply based on the board game that we played a couple of centuries ago. Then there's Zero Space. Zero Space is something that I did already play. It introduces some god powers, just like Stormgate has, and which Age of Mythology has and had. These god powers are like global battlefield powers that appear at the top of your UI that allow you to do certain super powerful things. It also introduces a hero mechanic. Then there are mercenaries that are a modular faction add-on to your main faction that you can pick. And overall, while it is heavily inspired by StarCraft, it plays out a little differently with some new mechanics, and I also found that it played out quite well. When I played Zero Space for the first and second time, some of the voices were still placeholder voices with AI, We haven't heard a lot about them recently, about the development of this game, so I hope development is still going well for them, as they are a very small team. But overall, my first look of it and second look was very promising and I really enjoyed it, and so I'm looking forward to it. It's classified as a base building RTS on this list, but I would go so far as to say it's actually a classic RTS. Then there's Falling Frontier, Existence, The Outer Reach, Sanctuary, The Shattered Sun, Dino Lords, which sounds interesting. I like dinosaurs just like any boy. Exodus, Black Sun, Broken Arrow, Edge of Chaos. There's War Chief. Then there's Hegemony 3, Islands of Giants DLC. Did any of you ever play Hegemony 1 or 2? Do you think that's a good or fun game? Then there's a Land of Sand, Sheep Tag 2, which immediately springs to mind as a custom map from Warcraft 3. And it's called a MOBA RTS hybrid. That sounds interesting. Sheep Tag was a fun custom map in Dub C3. And then there's Red Chaos, District Order, Everglory, Mars 2000, Dustfront. Dustfront actually looks a lot like a classic RTS when you look at it. It has the same rock and roll vibes as Command & Conquer. So if we were to describe games like we describe action RPG games, Souls-likes, then I would say Dustfront and Tempest Rising are Command & Conquer likes, because they combine rock and roll music with some kick-ass looking gameplay, and it kind of has that vibe. Then there's Liquidation, Global Conflagration, Ardent Seas, Emperor, The Battle of Dynasties, Immortal Gates of Pyre. This is another custom map spawned StarCraft-like game. This was initially a StarCraft 2 custom map, and they went to go create Sunspear Games, and they've been working on this for quite some time. I tried this out years ago, and it was alright, though I wasn't immediately sold on it. They're going through some changes, so I'll definitely keep my eye on it as well, though I'm not 100% sure I'm gonna like it yet, but of course that's a normal skeptical point of view to have until trying out something. Tempest Rising, I've played it a couple of times in early demo versions. I really liked the campaign theme and vibe. I like the music. I believe they enlisted Frank Klopaki's composing skills, who was also an original creator of music for Command & Conquer. And by the way, Stormgate did as well. But you can hear his touch in that music, and he's an actual god of making music. I love what he does. So Tempest Rising is also very inspired by Command & Conquer and trying to carry forward that feeling and legacy of that game. Then there's Castle Age Cultivation and Warfare, App-Light, Avant-Garde, and finally Dwarf Real-Time Strategic Conflict. Dwarf also feels very Command & Conquer-like. It is a classic RTS / base builder by Dwarf Team. I've bolded it because I'm pretty interested in that game coming up in the future. So overall, that's it for now. There's some RTS games that came out recently. The last really good 2 RTSs that have come out, in my opinion, aka my opinion, right? I think these 2 are the best 2 RTS games released in the last 5 years, are Age of Empires 4 and Dune Spice Wars. Before that, there was Spellforce 3 in 2017, and then we go all the way back to StarCraft 2 in 2010. So I don't feel like we've had that many releases, but when you actually look at the list and you encompass a wider genre of RTS games to make the list, actually, many RTS games have come out and are continuing to come out. They may just not fit the niche of RTS that I am more interested in. I hope the future of RTS is going to be bright and enjoyable, and that we'll be exploring some of these games that are going to be coming out together. On a final note, I've been preparing a rather large YouTube video on the history and evolution of RTS games of the last 20 or 30 years or so. It's going to be a much longer video, if I can even finish it at all. It all started with me looking for a video on YouTube to listen to it as a podcast, but I can't find many satisfactory ones on YouTube that cover this load. So I started making one myself. I really enjoyed listening to some of the long history of RPG games. There are some crazy nerds out there on YouTube whose videos I've listened to in the form of a podcast. Sometimes they're 6-hour-long juggernaut videos on the history of RPG. For example, from the YouTube creator called Never Knows Best. And then I thought, would there be anything like this for RTS games? And if there's not, maybe could I make one? Hopefully I can release it sometime this year. If you like this, consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content and you want to support it, and if you would like to see more. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.